So aging biology has many puzzles, and one of the ones which is an interesting one and kind of interesting to think about is the gender gap in aging. So women live longer than men, you know. So I'm about 3 or 4 years older than my wife, you know, and the gender gap is typically about 5-6 years. So, you know, prediction therefore she'll live about 10 years longer than me. So people have wondered about the gender gap. Why do women live longer than men, and what could be the explanation? So one possibility is that you can, a case that you can make is that you can understand it through thinking about the evolution of human longevity. And make sense of it that way. By the way, gender gaps in Russia, Russia has an incredible gender gap. It's actually about 13 years, and that's because the men live very short in Russia, which I think is probably because of booze. Actually, I'm not quite sure why it is, but it's very, very, very big. So where does this gender gap come from? So let's think about how human longevity evolved. I think this is a good way to try to understand it. So human beings live a lot longer than our closest primate relatives. So chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans. Maximum lifespan is in the region of low 50s, whereas human maximum lifespan is up into about 105, 110, that sort of area. So during the 5-6 million years since the common ancestor of humans and the other primates walked the earth, we've undergone a massive evolutionary spurt of evolution of longevity. So you can, based on evolutionary theory, you can make some predictions about how that happened. So why does longevity evolve? According to theory, it evolves because it evolves in situations where by living longer, you're able to have more offspring. So it must have evolved because of people or our hominin ancestors having children late in life. Now, if you look at the reproductive patterns in men and women, one thing that's notable is that the reproductive lifespan of women is actually not different to those of the other higher primates. So at the time when gorillas and chimps actually reach the end of their reproductive span, which they do shortly before death, that's the same age that women actually have the menopause. So from that you can deduce that it must have been late life reproduction in men that was driving the evolution of longevity in our ancestors. From that you can make another deduction, which is that if older men were having children, their wives must have been younger. In fact, anthropologists confirmed that the original kind of matrimonial arrangements for human beings, and almost certainly those of our immediate ancestors, was polygyny. So a situation where you have a single male with multiple wives. And in many traditional societies, for example, in Africa and South America and so on, the women will start to have children. Their reproductive output peaks as soon as they hit puberty, more or less. They start having children. But very often with the men won't actually have children until they're quite a bit older, quite often in their 20s and even up to the early 30s. So in men, the reproductive output is actually increasing as they get older. So this is a theory that's called it's called the Patriarchy Hypothesis. It was proposed by an American anthropologist called Frank Marlowe, that essentially we evolved our long lifespan because of late life reproduction in men. So then the question comes, well, why are women long-lived then? You know, if it evolved in men. So one reason why women are long-lived is because the genes that control aging are on the autosomes. They're on the chromosomes that are shared by men and women. So, although the longevity evolved from selection on late life reproduction in men, the women inherited those genes, so they therefore became long-lived too. But then why would women be longer lived? That doesn't make sense. So there's another piece of the puzzle that you can put in place to make sense of this, which is has to do with the difference in the variance in offspring production in men and women. And this is something you get across the animal kingdom. You tend to get in many species the variation in the number of offspring per female is much smaller than the variation per male. And that's because you have a situation where, if you imagine with polygyny, you've got a man who has 5 wives. That means there must be many other men that have no wives at all. So you may have a female who has 6 offspring, and you may have a male who has multiple wives and he has 30, 40 offspring. That means that there's a lot of competition between males to be the one who gets the wives, rather than the majority actually who don't reproduce, who don't get the wives. So that's our picture of our past, that the majority of men never had any offspring. They were probably killed in fighting and competition and so on. And the small minority get to have lots of wives. And so where you have very strong competition for being the successful, the patriarch, if you like, you can have trade-offs between traits that in early life allow you to be established as the patriarch. So things that maybe make you have a bigger musculature, or make you more aggressive, and so on. And late life harmful effects of those same traits. So this is consistent with this evolutionary principle of antagonistic pleiotropy as proposed by George Williams, the idea of trade-offs between beneficial traits in early life that have harmful effects in later life as a cause of aging. So that could explain how men end up being shorter lived. But an interesting follow-up to that, and this is getting a bit more speculative, I think, is that the sex difference in lifespan is likely to be linked to secondary sexual characteristics. So it's linked to traits that are controlled by sex hormones. So something which is established at puberty. And in males, one of the main determinants of male secondary sexual characteristics are testicular hormones, so testosterone and dihydrotestosterone, which has generated a hypothesis which has been kicking around in the field, which is that testosterone is what's driving the shorter lifespan of men. One of the things that appeared to support this notion was a study many years ago from the United States, which was looking at the lifespans of people who were in mental institutions who were castrated in the 20s and 30s, when there was unfortunately a eugenics movement in the United States, politics slightly related to those of Nazi Germany, where they were castrating people who they thought were sort of genetically unfit. So there was a study that looked at the lifespan of people who'd been castrated, compared them with controls from the same institutes at the same time, and they found there was an increase in lifespan of those that had been castrated, particularly those that were castrated as children, as boys. And there was something like an 11-year lifespan difference, very striking. But it was a single result, and it was hard to know whether to treat it as anecdotal. But then more recently, there was a study from Korea which mined data from archives of the eunuchs who used to be part of the Chosun imperial court in Korea. So these eunuchs, these were men who were castrated as boys, and they entered to a high rank in the civil service in the imperial Chosun court, and they kept very good records of their lives and births and deaths. And that data showed that these eunuchs actually show a remarkable longevity of the order of 10 to 15 years longer life than the controls, who were civil servants of a similar rank, who were working at the courts at the same time, but who were simply hadn't been castrated. So that seems to support this notion that there's some sort of underlying constitutive longevity of males which is actually brought down through testosterone. So is testosterone bad? Apparently it is not bad if you're older. So if you look, for example, at effects of drugs that block testosterone production that are used for treating prostate cancer, or if you look at effects of treatments of people with testosterone supplements when they get older, in fact, testosterone seems to be beneficial in terms, for example, of cardiovascular disease. So the only way to make sense of all of the findings is to argue that it's actually during, if you like, physiological and metabolic programming at puberty that this short lifespan of men is established. So that it's something that would remain to be established, but it's a hypothesis which kind of still stands, that men live longer because of the changes that their bodies undergo at puberty. Sorry, they live shorter than women. So that would provide potentially an explanation for at least part of the gender gap between men and women, why men are shorter lived than women.